Well, it is a privilege to be here. It's always a joy to speak to the contemplative family that I know is Contemplative Outreach. I've been an active member for the last 10 years, serving in our chapter in Buffalo, New York, as well as leading introductory workshops. I'm a commissioned presenter of centering prayer and have led plenty of those workshops to bring the practice to the people, because I know from my own spiritual journey what the impact of this practice has been so personal, so rich, and so deep. I really came into contemplation by accident. I was an evangelical student praying in my own little dorm room, and just fell into what I call the well of silence. It was like all the words just exhausted themselves, and eventually I just disappeared. And later I found this term contemplation. I learned of this term interior silence. A brother gave me a book on the practice of centering prayer, a Franciscan brother. And so took this practice and saw like, oh, this that I was experiencing by accident in my dorm room, there's sort of a methodology to it. There's a way to sort of cultivate this consciousness that I accidentally fell into. And so that was in 2010, so 14 or so years ago. And it's been my mission, if you will, to bring this practice into the hearts of other people, both the young and old alike. And so I'll share a little bit about our Closer Than Breath community, which is an online interspiritual contemplative community. We just finished our 90-minute contemplation day just 2 hours ago on Richard Rohr's teaching on the universal Christ. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But it's, just a real joy to always connect with the contemplative outreach family, because it's been a true home for me on the spiritual journey. I guess what I was asked to speak to sort of about the future of centering prayer. And so as I pull up the PowerPoint in a couple minutes here, I'll pose some questions for us. But what I wanted to start with was just this understanding that the practice is alive, that God is alive, the divine is moving, and our practice is therefore dynamic. And our practice changes us. And as our practice changes us, our understanding of the practice changes. So we are actively being transformed. I'm sure you are here because you've witnessed this practice transforming somebody in your own life or your own very self. We do the practice. We consent to the living presence and action, and real change and transformation happens. And so the practice is changing us. Our understanding of the practice changes. And then our experience of the practice changes. And we just go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I see it as this cycle. And I think it's important to name that because it means that the practice is evolving. Maybe the 4 guidelines remain the same, but the people that are practicing now, you're not the same person that started. Who you are today is a different person than who you were when you started this practice. So the practice changes, our understanding changes, the experience changes, and then the practice changes us. And it goes on and on. So there's a dynamic nature of this. Our understanding of what our self is changes. Our understanding of the divine or what God is changes with this practice. God is alive. We are alive. This practice is alive. And part of that is change. Part of that is what we'll talk about today. But I also want to just lift up the importance of talking about a practice like centering prayer because of its spiritual significance. Being a young person, and I'm sure you see it too, there's lots of language around mindfulness. There's lots of evidence that people are leaving religious traditions and going to more Eastern traditions or becoming non-religious or taking just a more secular approach to spirituality. And all of that is legitimate. When it's healthy to move beyond your religion, it's good to leave it beyond. If mindfulness and more secular approaches to meditation are helpful, then do that. But what I love about the practice of centering prayer is it has this deep roots in the Christian mystical tradition that we can water when we practice, but also brings us to a place beyond the Christian mystical tradition. And so I just want to uplift that this practice is spiritual nature, and that this world, as we witness it in so many ways on fire and falling apart and underwater, we need a spiritually rich practice to ground us. And I like to say that this is not just merely a mindfulness practice that sort of strips out the spiritual Buddhist teaching and gives a sort of simple mindfulness practice. This is a practice that takes us to reality. And so at this point, I'll pull up my PowerPoint here. I have about 19 slides here, and I certainly want to leave room for some conversation, some questions and reflections afterwards. And so, hopefully I don't talk too long. We'll leave some time for some conversation. Here we go. The evolution of centering prayer, embracing the future, really focused on the future. Some questions that I'm bringing into this is, how can centering prayer evolve and remain transformative in our rapidly changing world? I do believe centering prayer is evolving. It's evolving us. Thomas Keating's teaching evolved over years. His teaching of centering prayer, he wrote so many books, right? Because there was a new understanding. Even Father Keating's understanding was changing. So a new book was needed, or an updated way of saying what he had previously said was needed. And so the practice is changing, the world is changing. And if the practice changes, how do we make sure we don't just lose its spiritual connection? Because again, as much as I love mindfulness, I actually love Buddhism more. Mindfulness comes from Buddhism, really. But when you strip the Buddhism out of mindfulness, you get something that's helpful, but not as rich as Buddhism. So in a similar way, I want to make sure if this practice is changing or evolving, that we keep its transformative and spiritually rooted nature. How do we keep the prayer alive? I know part of this is an invitation to talk about what younger contemplatives are seeking in this world. So we'll get into that. How do we keep the prayer alive for younger contemplatives? And how do we meet the needs of those contemplatives? And what are their needs? And then finally, if the practice is evolving and changing, what are we willing to let go of? What are we willing to surrender? I don't have black and white answers to these. These I carry in my heart and invite you to ask them with me. So how the practice is changing us, who we are and who we are becoming. I want to start with this understanding, kind of the bare bones. And I see centering prayer as like a two-way path. There's like one street that takes you to the direct and immediate experience of God. This is what we call contemplation, the interior silence. Maybe some of the noise goes away and you rest in God. Simple, peaceful. But there's also the path of dismantling the false self system, the path of moving from our false self to our true self. From that wounded sense of ego, addicted to the 3 programs for happiness, and moving and touching that which is true, ultimately true about ourselves. And so you've witnessed that in your lives and in the lives of those that you pray and meditate with, that there's a healing aspect. But what I want to underscore here is that the healing aspect tends to be underscore the personal level. It's about me dismantling my false self, or God dismantling our false self. That I am unlearning my unique programs for happiness. That I can get in touch with my true self. And there's a legitimacy to that. That we are on a personal journey, we are on a unique path. Everybody's journey is unique, but it's only one part of who we are. Luckily, Thomas gives us another piece of dismantling the false self. It also has to do with unlearning our group mythic membership. All the ways that our identity is wrapped up in society, in culture, in religion, and our gender and our sexuality, whatever it is, who we are not based on who we are on the inside, but based on outside there. I was born into a Christian household. Naturally, I get raised in a Christian culture. And so what is true of that culture and what is true of that religious tradition, I want to hold on to that. And what is untrue? What is a myth about that culture or that religion? And am I willing to let that go? Letting go of the institutional ego, not only my personal ego. And so I think a lot of people, especially if we talk about young contemplatives or younger people, are very much confronted with the group mythic membership. Those groupthink, us versus them mentalities just need to disappear in so many ways. But what we are is not only a personal self, but a person in deep relationship with other people that are like us and other people that are very different than us. That we're in relationship not only to people, but to the planet, to the atmosphere, to the biosphere, to the land. And I think there's a growing awareness in all contemplatives that we are one, not only with God and with our personal true self, but with the earth and with one another. And that these wouldn't be just mystical or contemplative understandings, but that they would have practical implications for how we live and move in this world. So a quote from Keating. So if you accept the view that the self is a dynamic experience, that the self can keep on growing, then it becomes a true self in the image and likeness of God. Then there is a possibility that there is only one self. There's only God. There's only one self, or one consciousness, in fact. And so here's Keating later in life, not found in open mind, open heart, but this recognition that the self is dynamic, it's evolving. We have the true self. There's many, if you know IFS or internal family systems, it's this this therapeutic model that there's a self in me that wants to stop drinking coffee because I drink too much coffee. And then there's a self in me that wants to keep drinking coffee because it's so good. We have multiple selves, multiple motivations, multiple desires. And so the self is dynamic. And so we know this as we journey from the ego to a more authentic self, or from a false self to a more and more true self. And a true self that's made in the image and likeness of God, the image and likeness of the one God, one reality. And what this means is the true self that I have is not similar to the true self that you have. I believe what Keating's pointing to here is the true self that I have is identical to the true self that you have. That if we are beings made in the image and likeness of the one, then that true self is an image of one. There's only one self. There are thousands or billions of unique selves or authentic selves, that we would know our authentic self, that I do prefer coffee over tea, or you prefer tea over coffee. That's not your true self. In one level, it's true about you, but that's your authentic self. Here, I believe Keating is pointing to a reality that there is one true self, because there is one God that we are made in the image and likeness of. And so I'm sure you know this map from Thomas, that our practice is about orienting us towards the divine presence at the center of ourself. That ordinarily external to these circles is the world, and the world is a mess, and it's beautiful. And so our ordinary psychological self reacts to this beautiful mess on the outside of us. And that's where we live most of our days. And that's where, of course, our programs for happiness live. And that's where our mythic membership lives, because it's me reacting to the world outside. But our practice invites us really to let go of ordinary awareness, let go of the thoughts, let go of the emotions, close your eyes, let go of the world for 20 minutes and move into a deeper sense of self, a deeper spiritual reality. Cultivate spiritual awareness. And as we do that, we come into contact with the true self that all beings share, that the same divine presence that's in me is identical to the divine presence that is in you. We are one. And so when it comes to our practice, I want to look at this as a practice that really, in a new way, I believe, centering prayer is pointing us towards an interconnectedness, non-duality, not two. That centering prayer embraces the unity of life. Not only one with God, that is such a critical and foundational piece of our contemplative journey. The knowledge that our spiritual journey isn't about this like someday becoming one with God, but recognizing we are already one with God here and now. We just need to let go of the mental thoughts that say otherwise. And this is I believe, the cornerstone to our practice. That God is here, God is now, God is the divine presence within that we consent to. But that it doesn't stop there. If we go into our source, to our center, we find the same center that is in all other people, connecting us with everyone else. And this is what I believe, especially, not especially younger contemplative, but young people in general, but anybody that was watching the news and watching, you're in Florida, so Hurricane Helene and all that has happened as a result of that. We know our interconnectedness. I believe this practice is moving us from this individual sense of true self, my true self, that I am healing my personal story, to recognizing that I am a cell in the living body of God, connected to everyone. Again, from Keating, same quote. If you accept the view that the self is a dynamic experience, that the self can keep on growing, then it becomes a true self in the image and likeness of God. Then there is a possibility that there is only one self. And so if we can accept our sort of not two-ness, our non-dual self, Cynthia Bourgeois is pointing towards this, non-dual personhood, the one self, then we'll recognize that it's our duty as contemplatives to be active in this world, grounded in contemplation, rooted in God's being, rooted in the ground of being. That the contemplative life is in a just pure repose, just relaxing. But it's the contemplatives that need to step forward, rooted and grounded, to heal a broken world. Not just heal the broken self, to heal the broken collective self, the one self. So another piece of this that I want to explore is interspirituality and global connectedness. What I love about our centering prayer practice is that it does have Christian roots, but we're also growing towards something more universal than the soil, the one sun, the universal sun. And so I have these two plants on this. I like this. One of them's a Buddhist plant, one of them's a Jewish plant, or one of them's a Christian plant, however you want to think about it. Each in a unique pot, each growing a unique flower, but each growing towards the same light, surrounded by the same light, dependent on the same light. And what's so beautiful about our centering prayer practice is that you don't have to be a Christian to practice it. Christianity is this beautiful, mystical, contemplative tradition that we've overlooked centuries and centuries, hundreds of years, overlooking our own mystical dimensions of our faith. And so we can honor that, we can celebrate, we can go to that and nourish those roots. But also you don't need to be a practicing Christian to do centering prayer. And many people are coming to this practice through the 12-step program, through the 12 steps. In our own Close to Learn Breath community, so many people are like, definitely recovering Catholics, definitely some evangelicals, some ex-evangelicals like myself, some pastors, some formal pastors, some Buddhists, some lapsed Buddhists are coming into this practice because it's not so much a belief-based system but it's about the orientation of the heart, not what you believe with your head, but the orientation of our heart. And so just like mindfulness does come from Buddhism, and yoga comes from Hinduism, but you don't have to be Hindu to practice yoga. Centering prayer certainly comes from the Christian mystical tradition, but you don't need to be Christian to practice it. And so it's like mindfulness, or it's like yoga, in that it can be accessible to any number of people as long as you're willing to consent to the presence and action of God. An orientation of the heart, not a belief of the mind. And so I believe in this practice of centering prayer, that it is accessible. It has a universal spirituality to it that certainly Thomas Keating embraced as he led the Snowmass conferences. But that people are coming to this practice from a variety of backgrounds. And we can celebrate and honor its Christian roots while also recognizing that we can learn from other spiritual traditions. So I thought I would go through just a little bit about how I approach interspirituality. Most people are familiar with interfaith, and so I like to put these two side by side. And interfaith is, just imagine you get a Christian and a Jew and a Muslim and a Buddhist and a Native American all together, and you gather them in a room and you say, what do you believe? What do you think about the nature of reality or God or existence? And so these interfaith orientations tend to be very mental, conceptual. It's about the belief world. It's about, what do you think? How are we alike? What do we share in common? But what are we different? What do you think about that? Well, I think this. And so, okay, interesting. We can tolerate each other. We can tolerate difference, and that's good. And so it's mental in that way, but it can also be social when the religions come together and they say, we all recognize the need to serve the poor. We all share a common heart for justice. And so the religions can come together and open a food pantry that's not just Christian, but it's run by the mosque as well. And so it's social, it's mental. But interspirituality, coined by Brother Wayne Teasdale, is more heartful. It's more personal. It's more spiritual in the sense that it's not just about the mental concepts. It might include that, but it goes beyond it in the sense that we are here to practice somebody else's spiritual discipline, recognizing that all religions share the same mystical heart, that God is too big to be contained in one religion. And so there's a deep faith in interspirituality that says, even if we believe different things on the mental level, if we can get beyond belief and go to the mystical and spiritual heart of a religious tradition, then God is there too. And so rather than being mental, it's more heartful. Rather than just being conceptual, it has that spiritual undertone. We're not thinking about it. We're doing it. We're doing the prayer. The Christian is doing the Sufi zikr. The Buddhist is taking Christian communion. It's not just social. Interspirituality by nature is social because you're going into somebody else's tradition and practicing with an open mind and an open heart. But that does make it personal now. This great quote, theologians may quarrel, but the mystics of the world speak the same language. This is often attributed to Meister Eckhart. It is not by Meister Eckhart. It's in a book about Meister Eckhart, but Eckhart didn't say these words. But nonetheless, this beautiful expression that although theologians and the well-read and the scholarly and the religious may fight and quarrel, the mystics, regardless of the tradition, speak the same language. Thomas Keating's quote, God's first language is silence. All others are just mistranslations, including our own Christian texts. An interspiritual understanding recognizes that our belief in God is not God. My belief in God is my understanding of God. And my understanding of God is far from God's reality. And so where Christianity might take up a little bit of the blue part of this blob, Judaism maybe takes up a little of the part of the green blob, Buddhism and Hinduism and yada yada are highlighting other aspects of reality, ultimate reality, as Thomas would call it. And young people, just statistically, are connected and bumping up against people of other religions and other cultures, just in recognizing this reality, that the mythic membership we maybe were brought up into doesn't really fit into this colorful reality that is God. From Keating, the great treasure that interreligious dialogue could unlock is to get people to know and love other religions and the people who practice them. The attitude of exclusivity must be laid to rest. God is too big to be contained in one religion. And so this is one of the gifts that Thomas left us. Not only this rich teaching of centering prayer, not only this rich teaching of the psychological dimension of the spiritual journey, but also the interspiritual and interreligious way. That we would learn to love other religions and to love the people who practice them. But I know that can be a learning curve. Being brought up evangelical, some messages were Catholics are going to hell. And definitely Buddhists were going to hell, and everybody else was going to hell unless you were an evangelical like me. That was the weird culture. So it takes a lot of unlearning that mythic membership to say, okay, they aren't going to hell. Actually, I love them. Actually, I love Buddhism. Actually, I love Islam. And I love these people that practice it. Can you say that? I believe this is the invitation of cultivating consciousness that says there is one self, one true self. That the Sufi in prayer is going to that same source, that same divine presence. Buddhist in meditation maybe doesn't even use God language, but goes to reality, their very source. The same source that is in you and I. Therefore, we can love these paths because God is too big to be contained in one religion. And just to give just another visual before we kind of wrap things up soon, I like to break this down into the two expressions of religion, exoteric and esoteric, or mesoteric might be a better, more accurate word. This image is meant to depict a wagon wheel where each of those black lines moving out is a spoke holding the rim on the outside. And so we have the external exoteric form of religion. It's institutional. But then we also have the more esoteric or internal expressions of our religions. They're more contemplative. It's where centering prayer is. So in the external world, we have the building, we have the book, and we have the ritual. And each religious expression has its own building. The Christian has the church, the Muslim has the mosque, the Buddhist has the temple, yada, yada, yada. There's a different book for each of us, and there's a different way about going externally about doing our religious practice. But internally, the esoteric dimensions of each of our practices or each of our traditions honors the reality that truth is that God isn't in the building. God is in the person. God is already in you when you walk into the building. That you don't have to go to church on Sunday to meet God because God is already with you in the car on your way there. It still might be good for you to go if you like. But that truth isn't just in there. God isn't just in there. Truth isn't just in the book. It's not just in the holy book. It's in your direct and immediate experience. Richard Rohr would say, mysticism is experiential knowledge of God. Experiential. You can read all the books in the world, listen to the podcast, listen to Thomas Keating's Spiritual Journey series, and that's still kind of the book. But until you experience it, until you do the practice, or do a practice that puts you in touch with that divine presence, then it's just ideas that you read about. You could read for decades about playing the piano. You could read every book ever written about playing the piano, but if you never sat in front of the piano to play it, you wouldn't know what to do. So we need direct experience. And this is where our practice comes in. We can do our practice outside of the building, or you can do your practice inside of the building. But the divine is there. And so this blue line I've just added is where our practice is taking us. You could say centering prayer, you could call that any number of deep spiritual meditative practice. That it's bringing us from the external institution to the heart of reality alive within us. And that contemplative outreach, centering prayer communities live in this more esoteric, mystical, contemplative dimension, right next to God. And the truth is, God is in the external too. God is out there. God's active doing things and present. But where is God most naked? I think of religions as God dressed up. Each religion taking naked reality and dressing God up. And our contemplative practice dresses God down, letting go. And so I'm bringing this forward because I do get this sense that if there's a future for our contemplative practice, I sure hope that in year 2044, there are many people practicing centering prayer. I do hope that in year 2044, there are new books being published about our practice of centering prayer. And they will be different than Open Mind, Open Heart, but they will carry that same spiritual core, that same awareness of the true self, of the divine presence. And I think that we need to embrace this unity, this non-dual connection with one another, the interconnectedness of our world, and that our practice is pointing us towards that. And that we also need to embrace some level of the interspiritual orientation of both the tradition that Thomas embodied at the Snowmass conferences, in our chapters, in our groups, in the diversity of books that we read, that we would learn to say, I love Buddhism. I love Hinduism. I could have never said that 20 years ago as an evangelical teenager, And so we need to learn to love. And this is what this practice is cultivating. Love, connection with the source of love already within us. If our practice isn't leading us to love others well, then I don't know what good our practice is. All right, so here, just the final couple slides, trying to make things practical. I'll mention the 5 points. Read the books, read new books that are coming out. I know certainly centering prayer comes from a Catholic tradition. I was not raised Catholic. And I believe the last 5 books written about centering prayer, at least that I can find on Amazon, none of the last 5 books written over the last 5 years were written by Catholics. Which is very interesting to me. Makes me wonder about the future. But there are new books and books that maybe are explicitly about centering prayer. I think of Rich Lewis's book called Sitting with God, explicitly about centering prayer, or books like Caroline Oak's books, Practicing the Pause, Neuroscience and Contemplative Practice, looking at the true neuroscience of the mind and contemplative prayer. And specifically, she touches a lot on centering prayer. So read the new books, because this is part of the evolution of where we're going. Invite those authors, those new writers, those new speakers, those retreats leaders into your communities. Because there's a new and emerging way lives emerging that I think we just need to recognize and invite them forward into spaces like this. I put very specifically, support the work of Colleen Thomas, staff at Contemplative Outreach now, leading the diversity team, the 40s and under or Young Contemplatives Initiative at Contemplative Outreach. She also is the co-host of the Opening Minds, Opening Hearts podcast that Contemplative Outreach has done, which is another brilliant thing that they've done, because so many young people listen to podcasts on the train into downtown or in your car. I call it YouTube University, to be in the car and to listen to a podcast. People are coming to centering prayer, not through the books sometimes, not through Open Mind, Open Heart, but maybe through somebody suggested a podcast. And so I just want to uplift Colleen's work, because she's doing amazing work in bringing this practice to centering, or to younger contemplative communities, to people of color, to really create unique settings for people to practice this with people more like them in a similar stage of life, which is super important. I would say consider interfaith partnerships, a way of honoring your centering prayer and Christian practice, but also, like, what would it mean to have somebody to come in to talk about mindfulness and put that in conversation with centering prayer or yoga or whatever it is, whatever's in your city, whatever's in your near you. If there's young people at yoga studios, what would it mean to have a conversation between yoga philosophy and Christian mysticism? And then finally, to embrace how centering prayer is becoming decentralized. This is something that I'm just hyper aware of, is just recognizing, if I think back before I was born to the start of Contemplative Outreach, 5 years before I was born, everything centering prayer related was under this beautiful umbrella of Contemplative Outreach. Of course, with Basil Pennington and Thomas and William Menninger, but everything was under that large umbrella. And what I see is people are finding centering prayer completely disconnected from Contemplative Outreach. People are writing books about centering prayer that aren't members of Contemplative Outreach. How strange, how beautiful that centering prayer is growing and evolving and moving even beyond Contemplative Outreach. I see that as a good thing, something to embrace, because it means that our practice is uniting us beyond just the institution or the organism, and that people are going to take it, and maybe some people do weird things with it. I hope not, to bend it too far. That's part of the beauty of Contemplative Outreach, is preserving the tradition and the integrity of the method. Deep respect for that. And also just to recognize people are going to take it and integrate new ideas. And new books will emerge, new retreats will emerge. And it's not going to be so centralized under one organism, but there might be multiple organisms. And then finally, this just an invitation to also trust the greater flow, the greater work of the Spirit. I know it can be, there's this desire to connect with more people, younger people, more diverse communities. And I think we can also just pray for clarity about what our work is to do, and to get clear about that. What is ours to do and what is not ours to do? And I'm thinking of the serenity prayer, to know the wisdom, to have the wisdom to know the difference. Is this my work to do? Trust that something, a greater flow, is at work. Other people are maybe working on the thing that you desire most. So maybe you can relax. Or maybe you have this heart to do something. Then follow that heart, ultimately with trust. That's that.
I was reminded of a writer who's really influenced my thinking on these things. He's an Eastern Orthodox theologian. You're probably familiar with him. David Bentley Hart recently wrote a book called Tradition and Apocalypse, and is a wonderful, description of where our Christian tradition comes from and how it evolves and develops over time. And he really shifted my whole thinking about tradition as something one looks to in the past, as opposed to in the Christian tradition, always looking for the unveiling future. And, the future, and this is where, the Nicene Creed really came from, is the one day in which God will be all in all, that we are participants in the divine nature. And so I was curious what your thoughts might be about how centering prayer might be a practice of unveiling the future, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. I have to also, before answering that, I'm thinking of Carl McColman. Some of you might be familiar with. He's written maybe 20 books or so, many on Christian mysticism. And he had previously spoke at our Centering Prayer Summit, an annual event we do with Closer Than Breath. And maybe last year or 2 years ago, he talked about us, you and I, being the living tradition. Now, that just as you said, like we think of tradition as past, but we are the living embodiment of the Christian contemplative tradition, alive and well in 2024. And so when it's 3024, God willing that year exists, people are reading about the Christian contemplative tradition. They're going to be reading about this organization, Contemplative Outreach. And they're going to be reading about these people doing centering prayer. Oh, they called it centering prayer 1,000 years ago. That each of you, each of us are living contemplatives, living in the tradition that is alive. And credit to Carl for planting those seeds into mind here. But yeah, I think your question is a very good one, as I think of the nature of our practice. Its nature is the via negativa, the apophatic tradition of letting go, of approaching God or reality, not by what it is, by what it's not. I think we come into the world, we come into our practice with many preconceived ideas about what God is or what is true about our religion. And part of the dismantling of the false self, the letting go, means that we do open up space in our minds for more authentic truth, for more clarity of mind, that we are stepping outside of our own personality. William Menninger would say, or well, it was Thomas said, contemplation is taking a vacation from yourself. What is yourself? Your thinking, feeling, doing self. Thinking, feeling, doing, always. And our thinking creates veils. Our personality, our Enneagram type, your Myers-Briggs type, we all see a subtly different reality, a different tint. And so as we let go and these sort of masks sort of fall off, that we would be able to see the future more clearly, not based on what the conditioning we came into the world with, but through a sort of nakedness. Again, I love this idea that we sort of dress God up, each of our gods, even though we all probably believe in a pretty similar God in some weird way. Each of our gods is slightly different. Everybody's got a different dressed up God. And so centering prayer is an invitation to let go of that, to undress reality. I'll stop there. So,
Thank you. Other questions?
I don't have a question, but oh, how you are on with these younger folks. One being my son and how he thinks. And I always wondered, where did he come up with these ideas? And I was leaning towards Buddhism, and, it always kind of grated on me, but I just thank you. And I thank Contemplative Outreach and Centering Prayer for, opening eyes. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask a couple of pastoral questions. And one is just some suggestions you have for helping a person's self or a friend let go of mythic membership. And a similar question, helping parents who love their children so much, encourage their children on a spiritual path that hasn't been the parents. and not be afraid. I mean, just maybe some wisdom you have in either one of those categories.
I think studying Thomas's teaching on the group mythic membership is a good place to start with centering prayer. So I'm assuming you're talking about people that are engaged in centering prayer, because I think it's an underexplored teaching. I think the programs for happiness or the dark night of the soul, like those are a little bit more common. But just to sort of return to those, because I think there's something there that's often overlooked. But I also think that rooting our practice, again, this is where we can like really create some roots in the via negativa, the apophatic spirituality that says that with Meister Eckhart, God is not found by way of addition, but by way of subtraction. That what especially a lot of young people are going through is subtracting. They're seeing the reality, or they're seeing the membership or the conditioning that they were given at birth, and they're seeing how reality doesn't match up. It's that image of the little pink blob of the little God, and then they see reality. And it's like, wait, these are two different things. And I think young people are seeing that in a world that's social, that's connected in a way that wasn't for previous generations. Just bumping up against or with people that are different than them, religiously, culturally, ethnically. So I think it's a faster process of unlearning, of subtracting. But I think that for those that are battling that within themselves or within maybe their own children, as you spoke, it's a way to just embrace the sort of via negativa that is about stripping away to the nakedness. And maybe that's not, maybe their kids aren't losing their way, but they're finding their way. And it's a little bit more naked than the previous way. And to trust that, that helps. Good to see you again, Carol.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation. I was very much looking forward to it, and I see some of the things that are different from the way we would talk about centering prayer and the way you talk about it. In a very humble way and very non-dualistic way. And, I wanted to put by you my grandson, who is a student at Cornell, just recently was in town, and he told me, Grandma, I'm losing my faith. You need to help me. What should I do?
I think we often think of our contemplatives, it's like union with God, or other spiritual traditions, enlightenment, mystical and beautiful. But then we also have this orientation of the dark night of the soul, which I think is its own enlightenment, but it's dark. And we have these rich traditions of unknowing. And to recognize that what your grandson had previously known, it's going beneath the cloud of forgetting. It doesn't make sense anymore. And maybe in a healthy way, it doesn't feel good, but he's going into the darkness, into the dark night, into the unknown. And that can be its own enlightenment, although it's not as sexy as union with God. It's not as sexy as feeling the interior silence. But to invite people to sort of stumble along the way, because it's no easy path to feel like we're losing faith. We might be changing our beliefs, which is different than faith. If we can carry a trust that in spite of my changing beliefs, reality is still good, then that's real faith, trust. But to invite people to stumble, there's wisdom in that. Just because it's dark doesn't mean it's God isn't present, and we know that when we close our eyes. that helps in some way.
Hello, Keith. My name is Sue, and I have a kind of a contemplative outreach of Central Florida specific question for you. You've touched on it while you were talking, but we live in Central Florida, and if you look around the room here, most of us are of a certain age. And we at the leadership team of Contemplative Outreach are anxious to be able to reach out to a younger audience, to invite them to join us and to be able to hand off the baton to them, so to speak. Can you give us just a couple of practical things you think that we here could do that would draw some younger people to us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wish I had black and white answers, and I will give some thoughts that I hope are helpful. But I will point to just I think starting with connecting with anybody that's young in your community and seeing what they have to offer could be helpful. So if there's young members in your chapter already, and to invite them into leadership and to even invite them to speak at something like this, perhaps, because there's wisdom in the generations that come up in a digital world. As messy as it is, there's wisdom in the generations that are connected and bump up against other religions more frequently than maybe other generations. So there's wisdom there that you might be able to call forward. And I do think that bringing new faces, new voices, events like this, maybe may be a way to do that. When young people are on the speakers list, it might attract young people to show up. But I do just encourage the trust too that some greater work is at work. In one way, I was just in Atlanta for the Contemplative Outreach Conference, as mentioned before, and one of the things I walked away with was feeling a greater weight of responsibility, that in many ways it does feel more like me and my generation's work to invite the next generation in, more so than perhaps the work of Central Florida. Not to say that it's not your work at all or not your responsibility, but that the greater weight, the greater responsibility falls on someone like myself, maybe as opposed to you. So again, that doesn't mean you're off the hook necessarily. So I think you're asking the right question. But knowing the situation and very much understanding it from my home in Buffalo, New York, same situation. Yeah, maybe that will lighten the load a little bit, to know that I'll carry a little bit more if that's a help. So.
It's Glenda. So I was recently invited at our parish to take part in Ignatian Spirituality long retreat that goes over the course of almost a year. And I've long been interested in that. And so I've found it interestingly complementary, though they are completely different types of prayer. Can you speak a little bit to the complementarity of those two prayers, of centering prayer to Ignatian prayer?
Yeah, wonderful. It sounds like a rich experience. Yeah, I think what's beautiful to bring those together is really to bring in the apophatic and the cataphatic. Not fancy words aren't always helpful, but centering prayer being a formless prayer. Like, we let go of the thoughts, we let go of the emotions, we let go of our imagination, and we touch naked nothingness. And then inside of nothingness, all these thoughts and emotions come up, and then we have to let them go. And so that sort of via negative of letting everything go into the nakedness, that's certainly a practice that is emphasized in all world religions, certainly Christianity. And so that's why centering prayer we find so powerful, because we're letting go so deeply. It's really surrender. Where Ignatian spirituality, it's the cataphatic, it's the form. It's, well, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to feel the feelings. I'm going to imagine what it's like to be at the well. I'm going to imagine what it's like to be at the feet of the Christ, and to play with that in your mind, to pray with that in your mind, to feel the emotions, to smell the smells. And so when centering prayer is like, let it all go, the Ignatian comes in and says, well, let's play with it. Let's enjoy it a little bit. And I think that is healthy. And so I think a healthy and a mature spirituality has those sort of two foundations, the formlessness kind of meditations and prayers that centering prayer embodies, but also form. A little bit of we have five senses, we have thoughts and emotions. We should use them in our spiritual life too, not just let them go. And so we want both of those. And what often happens in spiritual circles is you just get one or the other. But I think we want a healthy mix of both. So if you're doing that, that sounds wonderful.
Maybe we have time for one more question, and then we'll move on to our centering prayer time.
Hi, I'm Basha. It's not so much a question as it is a comment that I keep hearing Thomas's words. It's living ordinary life with extraordinary love. So what you're saying is, whatever you believe, whatever your religion practice is, you're fine where you're at, because love is a common denominator in all of that. And I find that I have more or less unconsciously created my own dualistic world. That being on this inner contemplative journey and having all of these incredible experiences with the people who practice as I do, it separates me from my family. They don't believe, so I accept them because it's like, that's not where they're at. I have 30 years of experience that they will never have. So I know and I understand that. However, I get about love and letting go. And so at this place, I'm learning from my adult children who only know that their mother practices centering prayer in silence. But my adult children are all in their 50s, some nearing 60, and they continually to teach me what I already know and what I've forgotten, and do not practice with them, because their adult children are now getting married. They don't go to church. They question whether they believe in God or not. But my children practice unconditional love. They're adult children. And it's like, it blows me away, because one is getting married soon and he wants his father to perform the ceremony. Son used to teach CCD to confirmation children. And it's like, how do I please my son? Because they're heartbroken over the years, but he puts his own feelings aside and he's getting his license in being a notary public so he could marry his son. And so my question was, well, are you going to use any form of scripture in there? And he says, oh, I'll have to ask my son what he wants. He's the one getting married. And it's like, oh my gosh, how touching is that the father cares and accepts his son just the way he is. And the grandma's having all these questions. It's like, who has the problem here? Me. And I've been on this journey for 30 years. I got a long way to go. So, yeah, but it goes back to the beginning of what Thomas tells us. It's living ordinary life with extraordinary love. So regardless of who you are, whatever you believe, it's okay. I may be the one that's not okay. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. And yeah, it stirs in me just the call to pray and play, meditate and play. I think one of the shadow sides of our spiritual traditions is like, we're serious people. Like, we do centering prayer, and we're on the spiritual journey, and we want interior silence, and we want to unlearn these false programs for happiness. And as rich as that is, it can also be good to just play and enjoy ordinary life, unspiritual life. Be unspiritual. You're already spiritual to the bone, so don't try to be spiritual, right? So yeah, to put love at the center, to put some fun and play back into our spirituality in our everyday life, I think is really meaningful. But you're ending us right where I think it all begins anyways, is love at the center. So thank you for that reminder.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Keith.
Thank you all. It's great to be with you, and hello from Buffalo.
Thank you. And hopefully we will say hello in Florida at some point.
Very good.
Keith, I want to thank you again. Thank you for coming. We enjoyed your program, and thank you.
Thank you. Blessings on the rest of your day. And as you go and practice, I'll be off to a pumpkin patch with my son and wife. So be well.
Enjoy.